All right, so now we've got our sweater from the thrift shop and we want to pull it apart. So I have a few recommendations for your approach to pulling the seams apart. The temptation tends to be to just go right at the seam with either a pair of scissors or a seam ripper. Pull the seam apart and find the thread in between that stitches the two pieces of fabric together and just cut or rip all the way down. The difficulty with that is that when you do that, you run the risk of also cutting through the yarn that you eventually want to use. Because in a lot of cases they use exactly the same yarn or the same color to stitch the pieces together, and it can be hard to tell the difference, and especially when it's very tightly sewn. When you do that, like I did when I was pulling apart a white cotton sweater, you can get a lot of frayed edges. You can accidentally cut all the way through, or even just snag one of the strands of the yarn. So in order to avoid that, what you want to do is take a close look at that seam, and you'll notice that there are two sides. If you're a knitter, then I'll tell you that there's I want to call it a knit side and a purl side. I'm not a seamstress, so I don't know so much about it, but one side looks more like knitting to me, and one looks more like purling. So that side looks like it's kind of got purl bumps along the stitches, and this side, you can almost see it looks kind of like knitted V's, knitted stitches. So you want to look at the side that has the V's, the knitted stitches, and think of it kind of like arrows. So in this case, they're pointing in that direction. I'm looking at myself backwards. Yeah, they're pointing that way, which means that I want to start up at the side, up at this end, and I'm going to make a cut that'll allow me to just pull the thread and completely unravel this seam in the direction that those V's are pointing, almost like they're arrows. So it can be tricky when you are at the top of a seam, because sometimes there's big knots where they had to tie it off, or especially if it's a couple seams coming together, you've got all these knots tied together. So sometimes I start at the top, sometimes I start a little ways down. But what I'm going to do is take my seam ripper once, hopefully only once, and find one of those initial V's and just, oh, in this case it's already sort of cut. Just pull right through that. Now it's going to take a little messing around with it, but I've made that cut, and now from the other side, from the purl bump side, I'm going to find that thread, and I'm going to pull. So I cut on the V side at the top, and I turn around and I'm pulling from the purl side. Woo! Just all comes straight down. Oh, this is so beautiful. This will save you tons of time. You could otherwise be spending this time snipping through with scissors or pushing through with your seam ripper, hurting your hands, and potentially cutting through this nice yarn. Oh, it's so ideal when you find this edge. So you start at the top of the arrows and you pull in the direction that the arrows are pointing all the way down. And usually you encounter another knot at this end here, so you'll have to do some fiddling around there. You might lose a little bit of yarn at that side as well. And then you're done. So now you have to go through and do that to all your seams. Hopefully you manage to cut everything and pull everything in just the right way, and you get that satisfaction of just being able to just unzip all your seams. You might run into some trouble. One problem with factory-made sweaters is you've got all these labels stitched in, usually by machine, and so you might have to take your seam ripper to each one of the stitches there and get those out and get all the little tiny knots of thread that get stuck around your yarn. Hopefully it won't be too bad. Sometimes you'll find things that were knitted strangely in ways that I don't quite understand. I guess I'm not that good of a knitter yet, but for instance, I'm not sure what's going to happen when I run into this edging here and these buttonholes. And it looks like it might have been double knitted or something, like there was something else knit over the top. Anyway, you want to go through and do that to everything and have it all in little pieces. Get rid of any pieces that don't look like they'll rip apart very nicely. And then we get to actually harvest the yarn.